Ryan Foster hated the sound of metal scraping against metal. It reminded him of his childhood, of construction sites in his father's workshop. Right now, though, that scraping sound meant something was wrong with the research station's outer airlock. He pushed away from his desk where mineral samples sat waiting for analysis and grabbed his toolkit from the wall mount. The station was old, donated by some mining corporation that had gone bankrupt 15 years ago, and things broke down constantly. He made his way through the narrow corridors, boots clanging on the grated floor. The station wasn't big, just 6 rooms connected by hallways that felt more like tubes than proper walkways. His bedroom, lab, storage area, bathroom, common room, and the airlock chamber. That was it. That was home for the next 6 months while he studied the geological composition of Theta 7, a moon nobody cared about orbiting a gas giant nobody had bothered to name. The scraping sound came again, louder this time. Ryan frowned and picked up his pace. Then he heard something else underneath the scraping. A high-pitched noise, almost like crying. His first thought was that the atmospheric processor was failing, but he just checked it yesterday. Everything had been fine. When he reached the airlock chamber, he saw frost forming on the inner door's window. That wasn't normal. The outer door must have been compromised somehow. He checked the control panel and his stomach dropped. The outer door was sealed, but the temperature reading for the airlock chamber itself showed -170 degrees. Something was out there in that freezing space between the doors. The crying sound came again, clearer now. Definitely not mechanical. Ryan's hands moved on autopilot, checking the atmospheric readings. No air leak. The inner door was holding. Whatever was out there wasn't getting in, but it also wasn't going to survive much longer in that cold. He pulled up the external camera feed and his breath caught in his throat. 3 small creatures huddled against the outer door, their bodies covered in red scales that sparkled with ice crystals. They had wings folded tight against their backs and long tails curled around each other. One of them lifted its head and Ryan saw large golden eyes staring directly at the camera. Dragons. Baby dragons. Real ones. Not the stories his grandmother used to tell him before bed. Ryan had read the intelligence reports during his military service. The draconid species existed in the outer reach territories far from human space. They were warriors, merchants, and explorers. Dangerous when provoked, but not actively hostile to humans. The reports had mentioned they looked reptilian, that they could fly, that they communicated through some kind of telepathy. But seeing them was different from reading about them. These babies were dying. He could see it in how they trembled, how their movements grew slower with each passing second. Ryan didn't let himself think about protocols or proper procedures. He slapped the emergency override button and the inner door hissed open. Heat rushed out of the station into the frozen airlock chamber. He grabbed an emergency blanket from the wall locker and stepped into the space between the doors. The cold hit him like a physical blow. His exposed skin burned and his lungs ached with each breath. He moved quickly, wrapping the blanket around the 3 small bodies. They were surprisingly light, none of them heavier than a house cat. Their scales felt like ice against his hands, even through the blanket. He backed into the station and hit the door control. The inner door sealed shut and he cranked the environmental controls to maximum heat. Warm air flooded the chamber. Ryan sat down on the floor, still holding the bundle of dragons and blanket. They weren't moving anymore. He unwrapped the blanket carefully, afraid of what he might find. The largest one opened its eyes first. Those golden eyes focused on his face with an intelligence that made Ryan's heart skip. Then it made a small chirping sound and pressed its cold snout against his hand. The other 2 stirred, their tiny claws gripping the blanket as they pulled themselves closer to Ryan's body heat. He stayed there for 20 minutes, just letting them warm up. The ice crystals melted from their scales, revealing deep red coloring that reminded him of rubies. Their breathing steadied and the shaking stopped. When they finally seemed stable, Ryan carried them to his quarters and set them down on his bed. They immediately burrowed into his spare blankets, making soft purring sounds. The smallest one looked at him and chirped, then crawled out of the blanket pile and climbed onto his lap. Ryan froze, unsure what to do. The little dragon curled up and closed its eyes, apparently deciding he was safe. Ryan pulled out his data tablet with his free hand and started searching the station's limited database for information on draconid biology. He found basic anatomical diagrams and dietary notes, but nothing about caring for babies, nothing about how they ended up on his station in the middle of nowhere. He looked down at the three small creatures who had somehow found their way to his doorstep. They looked peaceful now, sleeping in his blankets and on his lap. Tomorrow he would figure out what to do, who to contact, how to get them back to their people. Tonight he would just make sure they stayed warm and safe. Ryan gently stroked the head of the dragon on his lap. Its scales were warm now, almost hot to the touch. It purred louder and snuggled closer. He smiled despite himself and settled back against his pillows, careful not to disturb his unexpected guests. Outside, beyond the thin walls of the research station, beyond the frozen surface of the moon, beyond the vast emptiness of space, a Draconid war fleet received a distress signal. The coordinates matched a human research station. The biosignatures matched 3 missing hatchlings, and the matriarch who commanded that fleet decided that the human responsible would pay for whatever they had done. But Ryan knew none of this. He only knew that 3 babies needed him, and he wasn't going to let them down. Protein bars were apparently dragon candy. Ryan discovered this on the second morning, when the smallest hatchling, the one he'd started calling Scarlet in his head, managed to tear open his emergency food supply and scatter protein bars across the entire common room. She sat in the middle of the mess, chocolate-flavored crumbs covering her snout, looking incredibly pleased with herself. The other 2, Ruby and Crimson as Ryan had mentally named them, watched from the doorway with what he could only describe as jealous expressions. Ruby launched herself across the room with surprising speed, tackling her sister and trying to steal the half-eaten bar. Crimson approached more carefully, grabbed a bar in her mouth and retreated to a safe distance before starting to eat. Ryan had given up on keeping them contained. They were too curious, too energetic, and frankly too clever. Ruby had figured out how to open doors by the second day. She just watched which buttons he pressed and memorized the sequence. Crimson could climb almost anything and seemed to enjoy perching on top of tall equipment. Scarlet followed Ryan everywhere and cried if he went into a room and closed the door. He'd also learned they were surprisingly communicative, not with words exactly, but with feelings and images that appeared in his mind. When Ruby wanted to play, he felt excitement and saw mental pictures of flying. When Crimson was curious about something, he felt her questioning thoughts. When Scarlet was scared, which happened whenever he left her sight, he felt her distress like a physical ache in his chest. The telepathy had surprised him at first. He'd read about it in the reports, but experiencing it was different. It felt natural, like learning to understand a friend's facial expressions over time. The hatchlings couldn't form complex thoughts yet, just emotions and simple images, but it was enough. Ryan cleaned up the protein bar mess, while the dragons continued their breakfast feast. He'd tried feeding them proper food yesterday, but his supplies consisted of freeze-dried meals designed for humans. They'd nibbled at the rehydrated vegetables politely, but showed much more enthusiasm for the protein bars, especially the chocolate ones. He made a mental note to ration those carefully. After breakfast, he attempted to continue his research work. The mineral samples weren't going to analyze themselves, and he was already behind schedule. He sat at his desk, pulled up his data files, and immediately had Ruby land on his keyboard. She chirped at him and walked across the keys, managing to close 3 important documents in the process. Crimson claimed the top of his monitor as her perch, her tail hanging down and occasionally swishing across the screen. Scarlet simply climbed onto his chest and refused to move, making comfortable purring sounds that vibrated through his entire torso. Work was clearly not happening today. Ryan gave up and decided to run system checks instead. The hatchlings could follow him around the station while he made sure everything was functioning properly. He stood up, gently relocating Scarlet to his shoulder, where she immediately dug her tiny claws into his shirt for balance. They made their way to the environmental control room first. Ryan checked the air processors, water recyclers, and temperature regulators while explaining what each system did. He didn't expect the hatchlings to understand, but talking to them felt less lonely than working in silence. Ruby seemed fascinated by the blinking lights on the control panels. Crimson studied everything with careful attention. Scarlet just purred on his shoulder, content to be near him. In the storage bay, Ruby discovered a box of spare parts and decided it made an excellent nest. She dragged tools and components into a pile and settled on top like a tiny dragon guarding treasure. Ryan let her keep it. The parts weren't critical anyway. The power generator room was warm, heated by the fusion reactor that kept the station running. All three hatchlings immediately perked up and rushed toward the heat source. They pressed against the safety barriers, soaking up the warmth with obvious pleasure. Dragons apparently liked it hot. Ryan sat on the floor and watched them. They were beautiful in an alien way with their jewel-bright scales and intelligent eyes. Their wings were still too small for flight, just tiny things that they flapped sometimes when excited. Their tails were proportionally long, used for balance and apparently for wrapping around things they wanted to keep close. He pulled out his data tablet and started taking notes. If he was going to care for these hatchlings, he needed to understand them better. Preferred temperature range, dietary preferences, sleep patterns, behavioral tendencies. Scientific observation was something he was good at. Ruby liked exploring and testing boundaries. She was the first to try new things and the boldest when facing the unknown. Crimson was more cautious, always watching and thinking before acting. She noticed details Ruby missed. Scarlet was the smallest and seemed the most emotionally connected to Ryan specifically. She became distressed when separated from him but calmed instantly when reunited. They were individuals, not just generic babies. They had personalities and preferences and distinct ways of interacting with the world. Ryan found himself smiling as he wrote, documenting their quirks and habits. That afternoon he tried to figure out where they'd come from. He checked the station's external sensors and found something interesting. 2 weeks ago, something had passed through the system. The sensors had logged it as space debris, too small to be a ship but too large to be a natural object. It had been on a trajectory that would have brought it close to Theta 7 before moving on. A container, maybe. An escape pod? Something that had dumped 3 baby dragons on his doorstep before continuing into the void. Ryan traced the trajectory backward but couldn't determine an origin point. Whatever it was had come from deep space, possibly from outside the mapped territories. He looked at the hatchlings, who were now playing some kind of game that involved chasing each other's tails in circles. How had they survived? How long had they been in that container? The questions piled up with no good answers. That evening, Ryan made dinner for himself and shared portions with his guests. The hatchlings ate enthusiastically, then demanded more protein bars for dessert. He rationed out half a bar for each of them and endured their disappointed chirping when they wanted more. Bedtime was an adventure. Ryan had tried to set up a nest for them in the corner of his quarters, using blankets and his spare clothes to make it comfortable. The hatchlings had looked at the nest, looked at his bed, and unanimously decided his bed was better. They climbed onto his chest the moment he lay down, forming a warm pile of scales and purring that made his whole body vibrate. Ryan stared at the ceiling and tried to think about his options. He should contact someone, report the hatchlings, arrange for them to be returned to their people. But who would he contact? The nearest human outpost was 3 weeks away by ship. The Draconid territories were even further, and he had no way to communicate with the dragons themselves about where they belonged. For now, the hatchlings were his responsibility. They trusted him, had bonded with him, depended on him. He couldn't just abandon them. Scarlet snuggled closer to his neck, her warm breath tickling his skin. Ruby sprawled across his chest with complete disregard for his comfort. Crimson curled up by his side, her tail wrapped loosely around his arm. Ryan closed his eyes and let himself relax. Tomorrow he would figure things out. Tonight, 3 baby dragons needed sleep and safety, and he could provide both. That would have to be enough. Space folded and unfolded as the red-scale war fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel. 27 ships materialized in perfect formation around the small research moon, their hulls painted in crimson and gold that caught the distant starlight. On the command deck of the flagship, Matriarch Sarah gripped the arms of her throne so hard her claws left marks in the metal. Her hatchlings were down there. Her babies, alone with a human. The sensor officer, a young male named Frost, worked his controls with shaking hands. Everyone on the bridge could feel their matriarch's rage. It pressed against their minds like a physical weight, making it hard to think clearly. Sarah was trying to control herself, but fury and fear made a dangerous combination. Frost finally spoke, his voice barely steady. 3 hatchling biosignatures confirmed on the surface station, Matriarch. 1 adult human male, no other life signs detected. Sarah forced herself to breathe slowly. 3 signatures meant 3 living hatchlings. That was good. That was something. But what condition were they in? What had the human done to them? Her oldest son, Brent, stood beside the throne, his wings mantled in an aggressive display. We should strike immediately.
Every moment we delay puts the hatchlings at greater risk. Sarah wanted to agree.
Every instinct screamed at her to descend on that station and tear it apart until she found her children. But she hadn't survived 17 major battles by letting emotion override strategy. Tactical assessment, she commanded. The tactical officer, an older female named Dawn, brought up a holographic display of the research station. Single structure, minimal defenses. Standard human design, probably civilian. No weapons detected. The human appears to be alone. Alone, one human against an entire war fleet. The absurdity of it might have been funny under different circumstances. But this human had her hatchlings, and that made him the most dangerous creature in the system as far as Sarah was concerned. What is his status? Sarah asked. What is he doing right now? Frost checked his sensors again. All 4 biosignatures are in the same location, matriarch. They appear to be stationary. No signs of struggle or distress. No distress. That was either very good or very bad. Maybe the human was keeping them calm somehow. Maybe they were unconscious. Maybe they were too weak to struggle. The possibilities made Sarah's blood run cold. Brent's tail lashed with impatience. Mother, we're wasting time. Let me take a boarding team down. We can secure the hatchlings and capture the human within minutes, Sarah considered it. Fast insertion, overwhelming force, minimal risk to her people, but maximum risk to the hatchlings if something went wrong. If the human panicked, if he had weapons they hadn't detected, if the station had self-destruct systems. No. She would lead this herself. She wouldn't trust anyone else with her children's lives. Prepare my personal boarding craft, Sarah ordered. Brent, select 4 warriors. Combat ready but non-lethal weapons only. We take the human alive if possible. If possible. That was important. If the human had hurt her babies, if he'd done anything to them, alive wouldn't be an option anymore. The boarding craft launched 15 minutes later. Sarah sat in the pilot seat, her claws dancing over controls designed for much smaller hands. Brent and the 4 warriors sat behind her in tense silence. They all knew what was at stake. The matriarch's hatchlings were the future of the pack. Losing them would be devastating on every level. The approach to the station was quick and quiet. Sarah brought the craft alongside the main airlock and initiated docking procedures. The station's systems accepted the connection without resistance. No security protocols, no defensive measures. Just an old civilian station sitting in the middle of nowhere. The airlock cycled open. Sarah was first through, her massive form filling the narrow corridor. She had to tuck her wings tight against her body to fit. Human architecture was always too small, designed for their tiny frames. The station smelled wrong. Recycled air with undertones of metal and chemicals. Human scents everywhere. And underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, she caught the scent of her hatchlings. They were close. Sarah moved through the corridors with practiced silence despite her size. The warriors followed in formation, weapons ready. The station was quiet except for the hum of environmental systems. No alarms, no signs of awareness. Either the human didn't know they were here or he didn't care. The biosignature readings led them to a door marked as personal quarters. Sarah paused outside and reached out with her mind, trying to sense her hatchlings through the metal. She felt them immediately. 3 small presences, sleepy and content. Content. Not afraid, not in pain. Content. That didn't make sense. Unless the human had drugged them somehow. Sarah didn't bother with the door controls. She grabbed the panel and ripped it off the wall, then forced the door open with brute strength. Metal screeched and sparks flew. She charged into the room, wings spread wide, ready for anything, and stopped dead. The human sat in a chair against the far wall. He was young, maybe 30 standard years, with dark hair that stuck up at odd angles. He wore casual clothes, not armor or weapons. His hands were raised in surrender, his expression more concerned than frightened. But that wasn't what made Sarah stop. On the human's chest, curled together in a nest of blankets and what looked like stolen clothing, 3 small red dragons slept peacefully. Sarah recognized them instantly. Ruby, her bold explorer. Crimson, her careful thinker. Scarlet, her sensitive baby. They were purring. That deep rumbling sound hatchlings only made when they felt completely safe. The human whispered urgently, "Please don't wake them. They just fell asleep 10 minutes ago and they've been cranky all morning." Sarah stared at him. Stared at her sleeping hatchlings on his chest. Stared at the makeshift nest that covered half the room. stared at the empty protein bar wrapper scattered on the floor, stared at the data tablet propped on the desk showing notes about hatchling behavior and care. This wasn't what she'd expected to find. This wasn't a human holding hostages or conducting experiments or doing any of the terrible things she'd imagined during the journey here. This was a human who had apparently been taking care of her children. Brent pushed into the room behind her, weapon raised. He saw the scene and hesitated, confusion clear on his face. The other warriors crowded in the doorway, equally uncertain. Sarah stepped closer to the human, studying him carefully. He didn't flinch away from her, didn't try to run. He just sat there with her sleeping hatchlings on his chest, looking tired and rumpled and somehow completely unthreatening. She leaned down and inhaled deeply, drawing his scent into her lungs. Fear, yes, but not the sharp terror of someone caught doing wrong. Just normal caution around a creature much larger and more dangerous than himself. Under the fear was exhaustion and determination and something else. Something that smelled like pack bond. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Explain yourself, human. Explain why my hatchlings sleep on you like you're their den mother. The human took a breath and started talking. He told them about finding the hatchlings at the airlock, about bringing them inside, about feeding and warming and caring for them. He spoke quietly to avoid waking them, his hands unconsciously stroking Scarlett's head when she stirred slightly in her sleep. He told them everything. The protein bars, the nest building, the system checks with curious dragons following him. He showed them his notes, his research, his attempts to figure out where they'd come from. He admitted he'd been planning to contact someone but didn't know who or how. Sarah listened to all of it while watching her hatchlings sleep peacefully on this stranger's chest. And slowly, very slowly, her rage began to transform into something else entirely. Understanding came slowly, like dawn creeping across a frozen landscape. Sarah crouched in the small human quarters, her wings folded tight to fit in the cramped space, and listened to Ryan Foster explain how 3 dragon hatchlings had become his temporary family. The more he talked, the more her anger drained away, replaced by something she hadn't expected to feel toward a human. Gratitude. When he finished his explanation, silence filled the room. Brent still held his weapon but had lowered it. The other warriors looked uncertain, their aggressive postures softening. They'd come expecting a fight and found something completely different. Sarah studied the sleeping hatchlings again. Their scales were bright and healthy. Their breathing was steady and strong. They showed no signs of distress or injury. In fact, they looked better than they'd looked before the transport accident that had lost them in space. On Ryan's chest, Scarlett made a small, squeaking sound and shifted in her sleep. Ryan's hand moved automatically to steady her, his touch gentle and practiced. He'd done this before, probably many times over the past few days. The gesture was unconscious, natural, the kind of thing a parent did without thinking. Sarah made a decision. Warriors, withdraw to the corridor. Brent, stay with me. The 4 warriors filed out, closing the damaged door as much as possible behind them. Brent moved to stand beside his mother, his confusion obvious but his trust absolute. Sarah settled herself more comfortably on the floor and spoke in a softer tone. Tell me about them. About their personalities. What you've learned. Ryan blinked, clearly not expecting this question. But he answered. He told her about Ruby's curiosity and fearlessness, how she explored everything and tested every boundary. About Crimson's careful intelligence, how she watched and learned before acting. About Scarlett's attachment to him, how she cried when separated and calmed only in his presence. He spoke about their eating habits, their sleep patterns, their preferences for warmth and comfort. He showed her the notes he'd taken, detailed observations written in clear scientific language. He'd been studying them the way a researcher would, trying to understand and provide the best care possible. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. This human had treated her hatchlings not as curiosities or hostages, but as children who needed protection. He'd fed them, kept them warm, let them sleep on him even though it must have been uncomfortable. He'd put their needs ahead of his own convenience. That was what Pack did. That was what family did. Brent must have felt her emotional shift through their bond. He looked at her with surprise. Mother, you're not seriously considering— Quiet, Sarah said gently. She focused on Ryan. Do you understand what you've done, human? Do you know what it means that they sleep on you like this? Ryan shook his head. I'm guessing it's significant based on how you're all reacting. But no, I don't really understand. Sarah took a breath and explained. Hatchlings bond with those who protect them in their first weeks of life. They choose their pack based on who feeds them, warms them, keeps them safe. It's instinctive and unbreakable. These three have bonded with you. In their minds, you are pack. She watched understanding dawn on Ryan's face, followed quickly by concern. But I'm not a dragon, he said. I'm not even the same species. How can that work? Brent answered before Sarah could. Pack bonds don't care about species. They care about actions. You acted like pack, so they bonded with you. It's rare with other species, but not unheard of. Ryan looked down at the sleeping hatchlings, his expression complex. What does that mean? For them, for me? Sarah considered her words carefully. This was important, possibly the most important conversation she'd have with a human in her entire life. Among our people, pack bonds are sacred. They cannot be broken, only honored or betrayed. If you accept the bond, you become responsible for them. You would be expected to help raise them, teach them, protect them. In return, they would be loyal to you for life. And if I don't accept? Ryan asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Sarah knew what tradition said. Rejected hatchlings rarely survived the psychological damage. They would grieve, refuse food, fail to thrive. But she couldn't force this human to take responsibility for children that weren't his. Then we would take them home and hope they eventually bond with someone else, Sarah said. But the separation would hurt them. Badly. You would be rejecting them when they've already chosen you. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Scarlet stirred again and he steadied her with the same unconscious gentleness as before. Ruby snored softly. Crimson's tail twitched in her sleep. Finally, Ryan spoke. I didn't ask for this. I didn't plan on becoming a dragon dad when I took this posting. But they came to me for help and I helped them. And now you're telling me they need me to keep helping them? Yes, Sarah said simply. Ryan nodded slowly. Then I accept. I accept the bond and the responsibility. I'll take care of them. Relief flooded through Sarah so strongly she had to close her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she saw Brent staring at the human with new respect. You understand this is a long-term commitment? Brent asked. Hatchlings need care for approximately 2 years before they reach independence. 2 years, Ryan repeated. He looked around his small quarters at his research equipment, at the life he'd built around solitude. Then he looked back at the sleeping dragons and smiled. Okay, I can do 2 years. Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. This human, this stranger who owed them nothing, had just agreed to upend his entire life for 3 babies who weren't even his species. That took courage and compassion in equal measure. This station is too small for growing hatchlings, Sarah said. Too isolated. You would need to relocate somewhere with proper facilities and others who can help guide you. Ryan's expression turned cautious. Relocate where? Sarah explained about Helios 4, about the red-scale settlement built into the mountains. She told him about the research facilities there, about the other dragons who could teach him proper hatchling care. She didn't phrase it as an order. She couldn't. Pack bonds were chosen, not commanded. But Ryan understood the implication. Stay here alone and struggle or come with them and have support. I'd need to report to my research institute, Ryan said. Tell them I'm relocating. They'll want explanations. You can tell them whatever you wish, Sarah said. But understand this, human. You've accepted a pack bond with hatchlings of the red scale. That makes you red scale as well. We protect our own. The weight of those words settled over the room. Ryan Foster had just become the first human member of a Draconid war pack. The political implications alone would keep the diplomats busy for years. But right now, in this moment, all that mattered was 3 sleeping hatchlings and the human they'd chosen as family. On Ryan's chest, Ruby finally woke up. She lifted her head, blinked sleepily, and saw Sarah. For a moment, she just stared. Then recognition flooded through her small mind and she squealed with joy. Mom! The mental projection was clear enough that even Ryan felt it. Ruby launched herself off his chest in a flurry of wings and scrambled toward Sarah. The movement woke her sisters, who saw their mother and reacted with equal excitement. Sarah caught all 3 hatchlings, gathered them close, felt their small bodies pressed against her scales. They chirped and squeaked and projected feelings of joy and relief and love. Tears formed in Sarah's eyes. Her babies were alive and healthy and home. But then something unexpected happened. Scarlett pulled away from the reunion and looked back at Ryan. She chirped uncertainly, torn between her mother and the human who'd cared for her. Ryan smiled at her. "It's okay, little one. Go be with your family," but Scarlett didn't go. She climbed down from Sarah's grip and scrambled back to Ryan, climbing onto his shoulder and pressing her snout against his neck. Ruby and Crimson watched, then joined their sister, choosing to stay with the human even though their mother was right there. Sarah understood then. Really understood. Her hatchlings had made their choice. They wanted both their birth mother and their adopted packmate. They'd expanded their definition of family to include a human, and Sarah found that she was okay with that. The transport ship felt enormous compared to the research station. Ryan wandered the corridors with 3 hatchlings following him like ducklings, trying not to look overwhelmed by the scale of everything. The ceilings were high enough for dragons to fly in, the doorways wide enough for creatures with wingspans measured in meters. Everything was built for a species much larger than humans, which made Ryan feel like a child exploring a house designed for giants. He'd been aboard for 2 days now, and things had not gone smoothly. Ruby had discovered the ventilation system on the first night and gotten herself stuck in a duct above the weapons bay. It had taken 3 hours and 4 increasingly frustrated engineers to extract her. She'd emerged covered in dust and incredibly pleased with herself, projecting feelings of great accomplishment while the engineers glared at Ryan like this was somehow his fault. Crimson had found the training room and accidentally activated a combat simulation. Ryan had walked in to find his careful, intelligent hatchling screeching at a holographic enemy fighter, attempting to breathe fire she didn't yet have. The simulation had taken 20 minutes to shut down because Crimson kept triggering the motion sensors. Scarlett, true to form, had stayed close to Ryan except for one terrifying incident involving the engine room. She'd wandered off while Ryan was distracted with Ruby's ventilation adventure, found her way to engineering, and fallen asleep on a heat vent. The temperature alarms had gone off. Engineers had panicked thinking they had a coolant leak. Security had been called, and Ryan had found his smallest hatchling sleeping peacefully, while 20 crew members rushed around trying to diagnose a problem that didn't exist. The chief engineer, a massive older dragon named Frost, had handed Scarlett back to Ryan with an expression that promised violence if it happened again. Now Ryan sat in his assigned quarters trying to figure out how to keep 3 curious hatchlings entertained on a warship. The quarters were actually quite nice, with a proper sleeping nest built into the wall and human amenities like a bed and desk. But nice quarters didn't solve the problem of hatchlings who wanted to explore everything. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was a gentle knock, not the aggressive banging he'd come to expect from frustrated crew members. He opened the door to find an older dragon waiting patiently. She was smaller than Sarah, with scales that had faded from bright red to a softer pink with age. Her eyes were kind and amused. "I'm Grace," she said, her mental voice much clearer than the hatchlings. "Sarah thought you might need help." Ryan could have cried with relief. "Yes, please, I have no idea what I'm doing." Grace entered the quarters and immediately spotted the 3 hatchlings attempting to build a nest out of Ryan's spare clothes. She made a sound that might have been laughter. "They like you," she observed. "That's good. Makes training easier when they want to please you." Over the next several hours, Grace taught Ryan the basics of hatchling management. How to channel their curiosity into learning instead of chaos. How to recognize when they were overstimulated and needed quiet time. How to establish boundaries without breaking their trust. She showed him proper feeding techniques. The protein bars were fine as occasional treats, but hatchlings needed more varied nutrition. The ship's galley could provide suitable meals if he asked the right way. She demonstrated games that burned energy while teaching important skills. She explained the developmental stages he could expect over the next few months. Most importantly, she taught him basic draconid communication. The language was partially telepathic, but also had verbal components. Certain chirps meant specific things. Different growls conveyed different emotions. The position of wings and tail indicated mood and intent. Ryan absorbed everything like a man dying of thirst finding water. Grace was patient, repeating things when he struggled, encouraging him when he got things right. By evening, he could understand the hatchlings much better and they seemed less frustrated trying to communicate with him. "You're doing well," Grace said as she prepared to leave. "Better than most first-time den parents, actually." Ryan laughed tiredly. "I've caused 3 minor emergencies in 2 days. Yes, and you'll cause several more before you reach Helios 4, Grace said cheerfully. Hatchlings are contained explosions. Your job isn't to prevent the explosion, just to make sure it happens safely. After Grace left, Ryan felt more confident. He could do this. He just needed to learn and adapt and ask for help when necessary. The next few days passed with fewer disasters. Ryan established routines that kept the hatchlings busy. Morning was for learning, with Grace stopping by to teach them basic skills like wing control and temperature regulation. Afternoon was for exploration, but Ryan made sure they explored approved areas with supervision. Evening was for quiet time, stories, and sleep. The stories surprised him. Dragons loved stories, Grace had explained. Hatchlings learned history and values through storytelling, so Ryan told them stories from Earth, about mountains and oceans and animals they'd never seen. He told them about his childhood, his parents, his grandmother who had first sparked his love of geology with her rock collection. The hatchlings listened with rapt attention, projecting feelings of curiosity and wonder. They especially loved stories about human children, fascinated by the idea that humans also started small and helpless. Ruby asked questions constantly, wanting to know everything about everything. Crimson noticed details and pointed out inconsistencies in his stories, keeping him honest. Scarlet just snuggled close and purred, content to listen to his voice regardless of the words. Ryan also started learning about dragon culture from various crew members. Most were initially suspicious of the human among them, but they warmed up when they saw how the hatchlings adored him. Dragons valued family above almost everything else, and someone the hatchlings trusted earned respect. He learned about the Red Scale Pack's history, about matriarch Sarah's rise to leadership, about the wars they'd fought and the territories they'd claimed. He learned about pack bonds and honor codes and the complex social structures that governed dragon society. He learned that accepting the hatchlings meant accepting everything that came with them, their people, their culture, their conflicts. He wasn't just Ryan Foster anymore. He was Ryan Foster of the Red Scale Pack, and that meant something. On the 5th day, a young warrior named Swift approached him in the corridor. Swift looked nervous, his wings twitching with uncertainty. "The others are talking," Swift said quietly. "About you. About whether a human can truly be Red Scale." Ryan had expected this. "What do you think?" Swift looked at the hatchlings playing nearby, chasing each other's tails in circles. "I think those hatchlings chose you. And I think our matriarch trusts you. That's enough for me." It was a small thing, one dragon's acceptance. But it felt significant. Ryan was building bridges, one interaction at a time. That evening, Sarah summoned him to her quarters. Ryan went nervously, bringing the hatchlings because leaving them behind wasn't an option. Sarah's quarters were larger and more ornate than his, with perches and nests and displays that showed her achievements. "Sit," Sarah invited, gesturing to a cushioned area clearly added for his benefit. Ryan sat. The hatchlings immediately climbed on him, their favorite perch. Sarah watched this with an expression he couldn't quite read. "We'll reach Helios 4 tomorrow," Sarah said. "I wanted to discuss what happens next." Ryan nodded, listening carefully as she explained. He would have quarters in the settlement, near her family's residence. Other pack members would help with the hatchlings when he needed rest. He could continue his research at the local facility. He would be expected to participate in certain pack ceremonies and gatherings, and there would be a formal adoption ceremony. A recognition of the bond that already existed, a public acknowledgement that he was now Red Scale. "You don't have to accept," Sarah said. "You've already done more than anyone could ask, but the offer stands." Ryan looked at Ruby, trying to eat his shoelaces. At Crimson, studying the decorative displays with obvious interest. At Scarlet, pressed trustingly against his chest. He thought about his old life, alone on a research station, studying rocks and avoiding people. He thought about his new life, surrounded by dragons and noise and constant chaos. He thought about which version of himself was happier. The answer was obvious. "When is the ceremony?" Ryan asked. Sarah smiled, fierce and genuine. "Tomorrow at sunset. The pack will witness your adoption. You'll be family officially, not just practically. Tomorrow his life would change completely and permanently. Tomorrow he would become something no human had ever been before." Ryan found he was looking forward to it. Helios 4 looked like something from a fantasy painting. The red scale settlement stretched across a mountain range that glowed deep red in the afternoon sun, carved partially into the rock and partially built on platforms that extended out over steep valleys. Dragons flew between the levels, their wings catching the light as they moved. The architecture blended natural stone formations with advanced technology in ways that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Ryan pressed his face against the transport window, trying to see everything at once. The hatchlings crowded around him, equally curious about their home. Ruby chirped excitedly and flapped her still small wings. Crimson studied the settlement with focused intensity, already mapping it in her mind. Scarlet just pressed against Ryan's side, finding comfort in his presence rather than the view. The landing platform was crowded with dragons waiting to see the human who had saved their matriarch's hatchlings. Ryan felt hundreds of eyes on him as he descended the transport ramp, carrying his single bag of belongings while 3 baby dragons scrambled around his feet. Sarah waited at the base of the ramp, along with Brent and several other important-looking dragons. But there were also younglings, curious adolescents who pushed forward to see the hatchlings and their strange new packmate. "Welcome to Helios 4, Sarah said formally. Then more quietly, "Welcome home." Home. The word felt strange and right at the same time. Ryan nodded, unsure what to say. The crowd parted as Sarah led them through the settlement. Dragons stared openly but not hostilely, their expressions ranging from curiosity to amusement to cautious acceptance. Ryan heard whispered conversations, felt the weight of attention, and tried to project confidence he didn't really feel. His new quarters were carved into the mountain itself, a cave dwelling that had been modified with human comforts. There was a bed, a desk, a small kitchen area, and a bathroom that actually fit his size. But there was also a large stone nest built into the wall, heated by thermal vents from deep in the mountain, perfectly sized for 3 small dragons who immediately claimed it. Grace appeared within minutes of their arrival, bringing prepared food and offering to show Ryan around the settlement. They left the hatchlings napping in their new nest and ventured out into the community. The settlement was larger than Ryan had expected, home to several thousand dragons of all ages. Grace pointed out important locations as they walked. The central gathering space where major decisions were made. The flight training grounds where younglings learned to use their wings. The market district where traders from other packs brought goods. And the research facility, a modern complex built into the northern edge of the settlement, equipped with laboratories, computing resources, and equipment that made Ryan's old station look like a child's toy. The director, an older male named Stone, welcomed him enthusiastically. "A human geologist," Stone said, his mental voice carrying genuine excitement. "Do you know how rare that is out here? Most humans stay in their own territories. We've been trying to recruit one for years." Stone showed him to a personal lab space already set up with basic equipment. "This is yours. Requisition whatever else you need. We have several ongoing geological surveys you might find interesting. The mountain range here has some unique mineral formations that nobody's fully cataloged." Ryan felt excitement building. Real research opportunities, proper equipment, interesting projects. This wasn't exile or obligation. This was opportunity. That evening, Grace helped him prepare for the adoption ceremony. She explained what would happen, what he needed to say, what the ritual meant. Ryan listened carefully and tried not to feel nervous about becoming the center of attention for an entire dragon pack. The ceremony took place at sunset, in the central gathering space. The entire settlement seemed to have turned out, hundreds of dragons arranged in a massive circle. Sarah stood at the center, magnificent in formal armor decorated with the red and gold of her pack. Brent and the other senior warriors flanked her, witnesses to what was about to happen. Ryan walked to the center with the 3 hatchlings following him. The crowd parted silently, all eyes tracking his movement. When he reached Sarah, he stopped and waited, heart pounding. Sarah spoke, her voice amplified somehow so everyone could hear. "We gather to witness a pack bond. These hatchlings, Ruby, Crimson, and Scarlet of the Red Scale, have chosen their packmate. They have chosen Ryan Foster, human, as one who protected them when they were helpless, who fed them when they were hungry, who gave them safety when they had none." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Among our people, such bonds are sacred. They cannot be forced, only accepted. Ryan Foster, do you accept the responsibility of pack? Do you pledge to protect these hatchlings, to guide them, to stand with them as family?" Ryan's voice was steady when he answered. "I do. I accept the bond and all that comes with it. Sarah nodded. And do you accept the red scale as your pack? Do you pledge to honor our ways, to stand with us in times of trouble, to be counted among us as family? This was the bigger question. This was permanent. This was everything. Ryan looked at the three hatchlings sitting at his feet, looking up at him with absolute trust. He looked at Sarah, who had every reason to hate humans but had chosen understanding instead. He looked at the gathered dragons, some skeptical, some welcoming, all waiting to see what he would choose. I do, Ryan said clearly. I accept the red scale as my pack. The crowd erupted in sound. Roars and chirps and mental projections of approval that washed over Ryan like a wave. Sarah stepped forward and placed one massive claw on his shoulder. Then by the authority given to me as matriarch, I name you Ryan Foster, pack brother of the red scale. You are one of us. Your enemies are our enemies. Your victories are our victories. Your family is our family. Something happened then that Ryan didn't expect. Every dragon in the gathering reached out mentally, their minds touching his in a brief connection. It wasn't invasive, just acknowledgement. Hello, welcome family. The combined weight of hundreds of minds accepting him nearly drove Ryan to his knees. Then it was over and the formal part of the ceremony ended. What followed was apparently a celebration, because suddenly there was food and music and dragons coming up to introduce themselves. Ryan shook claws and accepted congratulations and tried to remember names while the hatchlings played with other younglings for the first time in days. Grace found him an hour into the celebration, looking slightly overwhelmed. You did well, she said. Better than the last adoption ceremony I witnessed. That one ended with the adoptee running away screaming. Ryan laughed despite himself. I considered it. But you didn't. That matters. As the celebration continued into the night, Ryan found a quiet spot on one of the platforms overlooking the valley. The three hatchlings found him immediately, climbing onto his lap in their customary pile. They were tired from playing, content to just sit with him and watch the stars. Sarah joined them, settling nearby with her own presence somehow both companionable and protective. They sat in silence for a while, just existing together. Do you regret it? Sarah asked eventually. Accepting all of this? Ryan considered the question honestly. He thought about his old life, the isolation he'd convinced himself he wanted. He thought about his new life, full of noise and chaos and responsibility. He thought about three baby dragons who trusted him completely, who had changed everything just by being cold and scared and needing help. No, Ryan said. I don't regret it at all. Scarlet purred against his chest. Ruby shifted in her sleep, draping one wing across crimson. Stars wheeled overhead in constellations Ryan didn't recognize yet but would learn. He was Ryan Foster of the Red Scale Pack. Dragon Dad, Pack Brother, human in a world of dragons. And somehow, impossibly, he was exactly where he belonged. The journey that had started with a desperate scraping at an airlock door had led him here, to a mountain settlement on an alien world, surrounded by family he'd never expected to have. Sometimes the universe brought you exactly what you needed, just not in any form you could have predicted. Ryan looked down at the sleeping hatchlings and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new disasters probably. Ruby would get into something she shouldn't. Crimson would find new things to study. Scarlet would refuse to let him out of her sight, and Ryan wouldn't have it any other way. Far above, human space continued its expansion, unaware that one of their own had become something unprecedented. Diplomatic channels would eventually buzz with the news. Politicians would debate the implications. Xenobiologists would write papers about interspecies pack bonding. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, a human sat with his dragon family, watching stars wheel overhead, and felt more at home than he ever had before. The Red Dragon Pack had arrived for blood and found something better. They'd found proof that family wasn't about species or biology or even understanding. Family was about showing up when someone needed you, about accepting responsibility without being asked, about choosing to care even when it wasn't convenient. Ryan Foster had made that choice when he opened an airlock door for 3 freezing hatchlings, and in return those hatchlings had chosen him right back. Some bonds were forged in fire and battle. Others were forged in quiet acts of kindness that nobody was watching. Both kinds were equally strong. Both kinds were equally sacred. And both kinds could change the galaxy, one small act at a time.